The European Union looks to be edging closer to boycotting all of Russia's energy exports. A number of leaders say it must come eventually in the wake of civilian killings in Ukraine. The US is also set to announce new sanctions, including a ban on new investment in Russia. EU ambassadors are currently in Brussels preparing another round of sanctions, which they say will not be the last. They include cutting off Russian coal imports. European Council Chief Charles Michel says the bloc must sanction Russian oil and gas sooner or later. The EU depends on Russia for a third of its gas imports. Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell says payments for Russian gas are funding Russia's war in Ukraine.
Yes, we've now banned coal, but now we have to look into oil, and we have to look into the revenues that Russia gets from the fossil fuels, and we really have to make an effort.
While Western countries have condemned Russia for killing civilians in Bucha, China has held back on accusing its ally. Beijing says the deaths must be investigated and all parties should avoid groundless accusations.
事件的真相和原委必须查清。人道主义问题不应被政治化，任何指控都应当基于事实。
On the war front, Russia continues its offensive in eastern Ukraine. 2 people have been killed by Russian artillery striking a humanitarian distribution point in Donetsk. In Luhansk, authorities have urged residents to evacuate while it's still safe, warning that Russian bombardments could cut off escape routes. The region's governor says Russian forces have taken over 60% of the town of Rubezhnya. In the south, Mariupol is also facing relentless attacks. Ukraine's military alleges that Russia has been using ammunition banned by international law. The city's mayor says people have been dying from starvation and dehydration. 11 new humanitarian corridors will be opened today. And Philip Crowther joins us live from Lviv. Philip, Mariupol again, the focus of intense Russian shelling. What hope is there today for these humanitarian corridors?
Well, you mentioned there will be 11 humanitarian corridors established today, or rather there will be attempts to establish those 11 humanitarian corridors because, as you've heard over the last few days, in fact, over the last few weeks, almost since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, getting civilians out of Mariupol, a besieged city for weeks now, and getting humanitarian aid in has been almost an impossible task. There have been small glimmers of hope, a few hundred people who get out here or there on one given day in their private cars, but very rarely do actual convoys of buses get in and then manage to get civilians out. For example, today from the International Red Cross, we hear that 500 people were able to get out, essentially, to the city of Zaporizhia. That's quite a long way out from Mariupol. The International Red Cross was not able to go into Mariupol to get these people out. Rather, they had to drive out themselves, of course, in some serious danger of being attacked by Russian forces, as has been the case so many times. But the International Red Cross was then able to essentially join them and bring them out toward the closest major city that is being controlled by Ukraine right now. Now, Mariupol is absolutely a place that is still a priority for Russian forces. The east of the country, the Donbass region, we know is going to be very much a priority for the Russian forces, trying to take more land from Ukrainian forces, but the south as well. And Mariupol is part of the south and the east at the same time, considered absolutely crucial by Russian forces. And it is being pretty much destroyed right now. And there is a fear, after what was seen in Bucha and is still being seen in villages and suburbs and cities outside of the capital city, Kiev, that there could be more grisly discoveries, including in the city of Mariupol. All of those killings of unarmed civilians that happened over the last few days, or rather were discovered over the last few days, there are fears that those exact things could be happening as we speak in Mariupol as well.
Philip, you mentioned priority for the Russians in the east, the Donbass region. Of course, they seem to be making gains there. And no surprise, we've heard warnings from Mr. Zelensky and NATO that Russia is focusing on that region. Given these warnings, are Ukrainian troops prepared?
Well, look, there's been a relatively clear warning there from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that the Ukrainian forces, they might be confident They might have the momentum on their side, if you will, after Russian forces essentially abandoned the suburbs of Kiev. But still, according to the Ukrainian president himself, they don't have enough manpower and don't have enough weapons. They are up against a much more powerful opponent. That has been the case since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and since the start of Russia's belief that it would be able to essentially conquer Ukraine very quickly indeed. That was, of course, not the case in the end, with a very embarrassing military defeat for Russia on the outskirts of Kiev. But that might not be repeated in the Donbass, in the east of the country. This is an area that since 2014, large parts of it have already been controlled by Russian-backed separatists, giving Russia an advantage there in terms of possible territorial gains. And of course, Ukraine has to make a military tactical decision here. How many troops, how many weapons does it send to the east of the country? Does it leave other parts a little bit exposed, those that Russia has now left behind? But there could still be further attempts by Russia to invade Ukraine from the north again. All of these are big questions that the Ukrainian military has to be asking itself right now. And one of the big questions it is asking of the international community is for there to be more weapons shipments that can be taken to the east of the country as quickly as possible. That is very much where both the Ukrainian military and military experts outside of the country expect the emphasis of this war to move to over the next few days already.
Thanks for that, Philip Crowther in Lviv.
Harrowing images from Ukraine have galvanized Western nations to dial up the pressure on Moscow with promises of fresh sanctions. Despite that, Russia says it wants to maintain diplomatic ties with the West. John Beaver joins us live from Riga, Latvia. John, how does Russia juggle criticizing diplomatic moves by the West on one hand, yet still wanting to maintain ties?
Well, it is very difficult, isn't it? It is that balancing act between countries vehemently opposing what Russia is doing in Ukraine and these allegations of war crimes and wanting to make a statement. And a lot of them, those statements are twofold. One of them is sanctions and the other one is expelling diplomatic staff. And yet the counter argument to that would be, well, how will this ever get resolved if there aren't conversations going on all the time between all these different countries that border Russia, the different countries that make up NATO, and of course the conversations between Russia and Ukraine itself. So I think Moscow is aware of that as well, that it can't completely cut itself off from the rest of the world forevermore. So it does want to maintain some form of diplomatic relations, but it's very difficult. Just in terms of latest numbers, more than 200 diplomatic staff have been expelled from European countries just this week. It now takes the figure up to somewhere in the region of 350 diplomatic staff have been expelled from European countries since the invasion began 6 weeks ago. Most recently, we've seen countries such as Italy, France and Germany expelling diplomatic staff, a lot of that in response to the alleged war crimes that we've seen. Russia, in response, has promised that there will be retaliatory measures of a similar nature. They've already expelled diplomats and diplomatic staff from places such as Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, where I am now. Interestingly, though, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, said that this was very destructive for bilateral relations. And he warned that if we keep going down this path, then it risks further conflict.
Meanwhile, Moscow says peace talks with Ukraine are not going as quickly as it would like. And in light of all the recent escalations on the ground, it seems more roadblocks are in the way of a speedy resolution.
Yeah, it certainly does seem like that, doesn't it? Of course, negotiating peace whilst waging war is never an easy task. And there being some sort of meaningful resolution and outcome from these talks is what certainly the Ukrainians and the rest of the Western world is hoping for. But today, Russia is saying that things just aren't moving quickly enough. It was the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, who said the talks were not as rapid or energetic as they would like. But he did say that work on the talks is continuing. He described it as being a long road ahead, but said there was some skidding taking place at the moment and that they wanted more dynamics from Kyiv in terms of the Ukrainian involvement in the talks. Of course, for their part, Ukraine would say, well, Russia are the aggressors here. They could very easily end this conflict by simply leaving the country. But Moscow, of course, sticking to the line that it's going for the denazification of Ukraine, that it is helping liberate people in parts of Ukraine. So that's the line that Moscow and the Kremlin are sticking to. But yes, the conversations and the discussions and the peace talks will continue, but it seems that they're not progressing very fast at the moment.
As always, thank you, John Beaver in Riga, Latvia.